Critterpit podcast.
Yep.
It's been a little bit.
Yep, but it's worth it. We have a very special guest today.
We have the prestigious Dr. Catherine Pallister here in the studio.
So excited to be here.
Do you want to give yourself a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. Yeah, I'm lucky to be able to teach at Red Deer Polytechnic. I do teach a film history class, which is why I'm here, but I also teach lots of classes in mass media, popular culture, Canadian mass media, all kinds of things. I've been here for 30 wonderful years.
Awesome.
And yeah, I'm a lifer here at the Polytechnic, and just anytime students do anything, it's amazing and cool, and so impressed with everything you guys do. So yeah, super glad to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had Kathy for film history and now history of horror class.
And both great classes,
we're both
some of my favorite.
Really
There's a good shout out. Thank you.
Really loving the horror class so far.
Yeah.
Going over Canadian horror right now. Personal passion of mine. It's great stuff. Great content.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And here we are in a studio. This is our first time in a booked room.
It's a glass studio, so it's like a fishbowl, actually. Oh, somebody just walked by and looked
It
at us,
reminds me
too.
of
So.
SNL, how they film with the
Little bit,
glass
yeah,
there.
yeah.
And the audience is all out there.
Yeah, it was kind of accidental. I just booked like the first room that I saw. I didn't realize that it was so open, but
It's a little intimidating. Feels very
makes it
fast.
work.
Well, I have my back to the glass, so I'm in a better
you should be
position
okay.
than you guys,
You can see
probably.
everything.
Yeah, I won't be as distracted, maybe.
Yeah,
so,
that's good.
Probably have all of our fans coming up.
Yeah,
cheering.
it'll be a live
Probably,
studio
I
audience.
imagine,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
Might be a
Do you
mob.
have like names for your fans of the podcast? Like
we should.
Swifties?
We
Do you
call them
have
like the critters.
critters.
Yeah.
the critters? Okay,
Yeah.
that'll work.
Yeah,
Yeah, because we kind of derived our name from the Criterion critter.
Gotcha.
Critterpit.
Yeah.
Nice.
Very clever stuff.
yeah, not so much. But yeah, it's great. And so we're here to talk a little bit about Nanook of the North,
Yeah.
1922 documentary.
Yeah. We usually have our guests intro the film, and you're the expert here. So
Yeah.
you want to give
Well, I don't know about that. I do know a little bit about the film, have seen it a number of times,
Yeah.
studied it at different times of my life too. So yeah, it's a really complicated film.
Oh, yeah.
And even
Yes.
to use the word documentary, as I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll get into today, there's
Yeah.
some interesting perspectives on that. So the film depicts life in the Canadian North. As you said, it was, I think it was filmed a little earlier, but released in 1922. So during the silent era of film. And it sort of goes season by season and depicts what life is like for a family. And I have air quotes around family, of
Yes.
course. We'll get to that. A family in the Canadian North. So Nanook is our title character. He's the hunter. Nanook means polar bear, I believe.
Yeah.
And so he is a very strong hunter character. And then we also have Nanook's, again, air quotes, wives, Nyla and Kunayu, and then his children as well. And then there's also lots of dogs.
Yes.
So I'm a cat
and
person,
puppies.
but even I admit the dogs
Yeah.
are really cute.
Dogs
in
are
this movie.
adorable.
Until they're a little scary.
A little bit,
certain
yeah. Well, the
point.
puppies
Scrap
are
a
cute.
little
The
bit.
big,
Puppies are
the big
cute.
huskies, of course, that you might find in the
Yeah.
Canadian North, doing Adidas rods and whatnot, are a little scary.
Yes.
So yeah, it's kind of a day in the life in a lot of ways. That sort of seasonal look
Yeah,
at the
slice
things
of
they would
life.
do, slice of life, exactly. Living in the isolated, really difficult environmental conditions of the Canadian North in the early 1920s. And so they are depicted, for example, one of the most famous scenes I know you guys have seen is the igloo scene.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a really interesting one. There's also scenes with them going to the trading post and encountering settlers, white people, for the looks like not the first time, but sort of it's again, as we'll talk
Quite
about. I'm
constructed.
sure
Yeah.
it's a little bit artificial the way they're encountering settler culture in a lot of the scenes. And yeah, there's hunting scenes, there's these sort of daily life scenes, and just sort of looking at what their lives would have been like in the 1920s, sort of.
Yeah.
So the film says it's a really interesting one. It's the first documentary features, right?
Right, and I think even to call it a documentary,
Yeah.
it's really interesting because it's often labeled one of the first documentary feature films. So there would have been shorter, like the documentary film tradition was around since the very early days. So early films, they would just, as we do, tape our friends doing
Train-
things
yeah,
or
train
video.
arriving at
We'd get our
station.
phone out.
Yeah.
So that would have been, they were called the actualities. They were in French, but also in other national cinemas. And so just filming regular people doing regular things, just to show the magic of film, basically.
Yeah.
How cool this new technology is.
Exactly. Yeah. So then it kind of people were more interested in stories a lot of times than narratives. So moved into a lot more of the shorter narratives, telling a story of some sort, maybe based on a real story, maybe not.
Yeah.
And then the evolution, in the 19-teens, if you will, 1910, 1915, to the full-length feature film.
Yeah.
And so this is relatively soon after, really, even the full-length film
Yeah.
evolution. And this is as a documentary, the
Yeah.
actual documentary field didn't exist. So it's like trying to invent something that didn't exist,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even not even sure what you're inventing at the time.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
there's, I think I'll give it away here. There's
Yeah.
lots of stage scenes in it,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's one of the controversies. Is so many scenes in the film were staged
Yeah.
that Flaherty had Nanook and his family fake,
Yeah.
basically,
Yeah. Yeah.
what
Nanook
was going on. So
It's not even his real name.
it
Yeah,
is not.
exactly.
So you
It's,
have his name now. Can you pronounce it better than I can?
Try my best.
Wrote it down.
Elak.
I think so.
Yeah, it's a
You're
tough one.
Doing some practicing before you got here.
Yeah.
I practice
Some
it
of the
always
names.
in class before I teach it in class, and then I never quite get it right. So
Yeah.
'cause
Yeah.
the pronunciation isn't exactly phonetic either. So yeah. So and Nanook is in that way a character,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
He's
He and
a
his
brave
family.
hero who
Yeah.
faces the waste, you know.
Yeah,
Do I give away the secret about the family now?
Yeah,
I think
go
so.
for it.
Okay, we might as well. So it's not his family.
No.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
They were probably women that Flaherty was in a relationship. That's
that's what I
what you
saw.
never know
Yeah.
quite what to believe, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
I've read one thing and then another, but Flaherty was most likely in a relationship with one or both of these women. His
Yeah,
wife is a big proponent of his work, interestingly enough.
Yeah,
So if you
saw that
watch
she
the
even edited this film,
Yeah.
right?
she did, and
Yeah.
she speaks on. If you look at some of the DVD extras, she speaks on that as well and talks about
That'd
the
be
film.
really
so,
fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that would be his, Southern
Yeah.
wife.
I heard a rumor. I don't know how substantiated this is that Flaherty actually had like an affair with one of the Inuit women of the tribe.
That maybe one or
Yeah.
both of the women that
And-
were on in the film as
Yeah.
Nanook's wife. Nanook's a single guy playing a father, and I think it's a pretty substantiated. You just never know quite what the truth is, but it seems pretty
Yeah.
substantiated that he was probably with Nyla and possibly with both of them at
Okay.
the time.
And I don't know how true this part is, but he allegedly abandoned them to raise their child.
Yeah, that's why I said I'm not sure if the kids are his kids that you see or these are kids that they already had.
Yeah.
But yeah, he left them up north and went back
Yeah.
down to his southern wife, who, as you say, was very involved with his career as well in a different sort of way. So.
Yes.
Definitely interesting. Because like I think this film is doing a lot of good, even in its constructed nature. Right? It's cool to see the culture documented in the most faithful way we'd ever see it. I think. Right.
Yeah, so to try to silver lining it in some
Yeah.
ways,
Yeah.
because it is. I said it's a complicated movie, right?
Yeah,
and I do
very
think we
complicated.
wouldn't have these visuals of a way of life
Yeah,
that was
really
disappearing.
gorgeous visuals.
Yeah.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of what he had Nanook sort of recreate would have been maybe what Nanook's father or
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
or 15 years ago
That's-
would have done.
Yeah, that's what it really felt like to me as well, where it's like this first interaction with a trade person.
Yeah, that seems pretty rough.
Yeah,
too.
and it's like clearly they had an established relationship. Like even in the
Yeah.
movie, you see all the like furs and stuff behind them.
Yeah.
Like
It's
Yeah.
kind of like this romanticized version of what
Totally.
he wants him to be, like kind of like the noble savage archetype, stereotype, I should say, and like they get othered quite a bit, which is
Very much so.
Yes.
very unfortunate. But for the 1920s, I think it's doing a lot better than anything else at that time. I
At
feel.
least there's representation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I teach a lot of classes in pop culture, and absence of representation, if you don't ever see yourself,
Yeah.
is really challenging for people, right? You want to see some representation. Now, then the question becomes if it's biased representation,
Yeah.
false representation, is
Yeah.
that better than no representation? Some people
Yeah.
say yes, some people say no. I mean, I'm a not indigenous person, so I might have a different perspective.
Yeah.
I mentioned I also encountered this film years and years ago, and
Yeah.
learned about it. And I knew about it before grad school. We talked about it,
Mm-hmm.
and then I actually saw the full film in grad school when I was at U of C, writing on a related topic. And I really liked it, and it was problematic though too.
Very
Like you
problematic,
can't help
yeah.
but see that. And then 30 years later, or maybe 10 years, 20 years later, when I started teaching the film class, I saw it through even fresher set of
Yeah.
eyes. Seeing it through students' eyes for one thing, obviously,
Yeah.
and then just even through my own eyes that had grown older, basically.
Yeah, I think one of the rougher scenes is like where he's trying to take a bite out of the
yeah,
gramophone. Or
Yeah,
the,
like a
the
record,
record.
basically. Yeah.
Which is really ridiculous, especially
Yeah.
when you know that in real life they were very well acquainted with a lot of technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read a fact that they helped out on the film crew a lot for the filming of the film.
They
Yeah.
did.
And
Yeah.
that they were more acquainted with the cameras than Flaherty himself.
I
which is,
read that Flaherty had only taken like a 3-week
Yeah.
film course before coming up
Which
north
is
to film this.
so ironic, so rich.
Well,
Yeah.
But again, there's the good and the bad. So he did an anthropological, especially with the second version of the film, as you referenced. He had them look at at the dailies, quote unquote,
Yeah.
at night.
Yeah.
He'd have them look at them, give feedback. So he was making a film about them, but he was also, to an extent, making a film with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it doesn't come across that way all the time, right?
No.
And he might have pitched, kind of pitched it more as I'm trying to make a film that honors your way of life before it disappears. That's sort of the line
Yeah.
that's often used. But that's different than some documentary filmmakers. So it's kind of try to figure out where that line is for him, but also for other documentarians.
And I'd say most of the film, in my opinion, comes across as coming from a place of like admiration and respect, because you see such harsh conditions. It's such a brutal frontier.
Yeah.
And to see how they survived, it feels like coming from a place of respect, even though how it's translated often does not land that way, especially 100 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But to give Flaherty any credit, I think he did really admire the Inuit people.
I do too.
Yeah.
Again, I'm coming at this from a different perspective
Yeah.
than an Indigenous person would, for sure.
Yeah.
But the line I also use is, just because you didn't mean to do something
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
mean there's not consequences. So I used to
Best
tell my kid,
intentions and all that.
just because I didn't mean to back over your bike in the driveway doesn't mean that
Yeah.
you no longer, that you have a bike
Yeah.
now,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So I think there's that too. I do think he was well intentioned. I think in the time period, in his understanding of everything in life, he thought the Canadian North was a really amazing place,
Yeah.
and he thought the people in the Canadian North were really
Yeah,
amazing.
'cause-
Did he really represent that in this film appropriately? No.
No.
Yeah.
There's some representation, but again, it's really problematic. I think it could be really difficult
Yeah.
for a lot of people to watch because of the
Oh, yeah, for
stereotypes
sure.
and things that he
For sure.
represents. Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of the film kind of like infantilizes the Inuit people and like simplifies them down
Absolutely,
quite a bit,
yeah.
which
Yeah.
is pretty gross.
Yeah.
Pretty sad to see.
Absolutely. And I mean, even in the movie, like you see, like the whole kind of narrative arc is like it's starving or like feast, right? It's all famine or feast.
Yeah.
There's never really an in between, like kind of regular daily life, or,
Yeah.
from what I would guess.
Yeah. So there's those moments of joy, but
Yeah.
there's also the harshness, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that's the juxtapositioning that he was going for.
Yeah.
To good effect, for sure.
absolutely, yeah.
So I always heard, again, don't know 100% if this is true, but I always heard that Nanook had died of starvation, right? And then you find out later that maybe Flaherty sort of spread that rumor to
Yeah.
romanticize his film, and he actually died of TB, tuberculosis.
Yeah.
So, and didn't die, out hunting. Nanook, the great hunter,
Yeah.
didn't die out in the middle of nowhere. He died at home.
Yeah.
So even that, like the
More
mythology
modern
around
death.
the character,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see like the way its value against its constructed nature. It's fascinating. It's a time capsule, nonetheless.
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
It is a time capsule. If we keep it in its time, maybe
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a good way to understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to like watch it without thinking like, oh, this is 1922. I can give it a little slack,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
or at least for me, looking at it like that. I watched a movie, not recently, but a couple of years ago, called The Shadow of the Wolf. And it's also about Inuit culture and Inuit people, played by entirely non-Inuit actors.
Is that the one with Toshiro?
Yeah, with
Mifune?
Toshiro Mifune. Yeah, and he plays an Inuit guy.
Oh boy.
And that's from like the 90s, and
Yeah.
takes a very simplified, like I would say, more harmful, reductive look at Inuit people than even this movie does.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that this movie's great
No.
either, but
But
The bar is low,
yeah, exactly.
right?
The bar is low for Indigenous representation. And
Yeah.
as an Indigenous person, it is good to see some representation, at least I think.
Yeah, for sure.
It's hard. I'm not an Inuit person, but yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think another technical aspect of this movie that's to be appreciated is kind of like the technical aspect, right? This is Flaherty's like first time filmmaker.
Yep.
And just the shots that are achieved are so gorgeous. Like
Yep.
to just capture that environment in full is really lovely. And the hunts and stuff, it's really great stuff. Really effective storytelling. on
Yeah,
a
the visuals
technical
are,
level.
even pretty early in the whole film industry's, evolution. The visuals are pretty amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's beautiful, full stop.
Yeah.
The landscape
Yeah.
is, and so maybe it's easy to make it look as beautiful as he does. But he does capture it, I think, quite
Yeah.
nicely a lot of times, right?
I would even say the editing is quite strong. Like for a 1922 movie, I'm quite engaged throughout the whole thing. The version I watched didn't have any music or anything.
Oh, wow.
And he uses a lot of like insert shots where it's like we'll see the wide of them cutting up or putting the stuff on the canoe, and then we'll insert to that, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I don't normally see
it's-
that in a movie.
It's quite
This-
informational,
Yeah.
regardless. Even if in the way it's showing it, it's fake and constructed. It's still like translating an interesting culture and interesting things like igloo construction, right? What they eat, how they survive out there. It's pretty engrossing stuff.
Yeah, a couple things in terms of he does what I call a portrait shot. Maybe you guys have a better film term for it, but he makes his participants, characters, whatever, almost like he's taking a picture of them, like a still image of them. Where like the first shot of Nanook is really beautiful, Naya really beautiful with the baby and stuff. So he's able to capture their humanity, I think, very nicely. Alongside of those big landscapes,
Well, it's funny too. Like right after all these like wonderful, portraits of them, they immediately cut to them getting out of the canoe, like
the clown car.
Clown car bit.
So you go from like really humanizing these people to kind of making a joke out of it.
It's
interesting.
Characters then, right? But I think Nanook, for the most part, is like a pretty engaging protagonist too. Just
very likable for sure.
Very likable.
Yeah.
He does some great physical comedy in this as well when he's trying to catch the seal, I think. At the ice fishing hole. It's just it's hilarious. It's great. And that's a part that also feels very like over the top and like Nanook, he knew what he was doing, right?
Yeah.
He was
Well,
into
and there
that.
was there's a couple of those scenes, but there's one scene where the animal is not dead yet, and they were trying to get the shot, and they're standing there. They had this. I'm an animal lover, of course. There's a gun, and they were like, "Well, we would use the gun now to put it out of its misery because we use guns now. We don't just
I do."
And Flaherty like kind of made the shot go on and on, like almost torturing the animal might be being a little bit strong because but they, the people that were there were uncomfortable with what he was doing, like the falsification of what was going on. Yeah,
it leaves a bad taste in the mouth for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But very impressive film, but problematic. It's can't talk the one without the other.
And I think it can be both. Again, I would say as a non-Indigenous person, I would have maybe a different read. I would totally understand somebody having a very, very different read, a very, a very harsh read of this. I think that's very understandable, not just because of this film in and of itself, but because of the legacy that it starts and contributes to as well.
And potentially like the impacts that Flaherty had on those people too.
Absolutely. Like the direct impact on his quote-unquote wives up there in the community for sure.
Yeah, it's too bad that I think a lot of that is just lost, right? You don't know all these deeper
history.
Yeah,
it's lost in the constructed histories of everything.
Yeah,
it's too muddied.
Yeah,
what is real? Very interesting movie.
It is.
The best way to put it.
As I said, it may not be for everyone. I wouldn't necessarily label it with a trigger warning necessarily, but I think people should know what they get into when they're watching it. And some people might be better off watching a scene or two versus the whole thing.
Absolutely,
That might be a little more comfortable for them.
And I think it's good that we've become more critical of movies like this too. We're not just taking it at face value.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think that's you guys know that my approach is not to not watch something because it's problematic, but to watch it and talk about why it's problematic. And I'm in education because I think people can change.
Yeah,
and I think we can all learn and be better and do better, right? And I think that's part of looking at a film like this to say, we can honor the fact that he probably did have some pretty positive feelings about the community that he was portraying. He probably did try to, capture it and sort of, give it a legacy that it might not otherwise have had. But then there's all the other stuff, the faking, right? And, I mean, that's a bigger question for documentary film in general, but and his treatment of the people that he was working with. Again, in some ways honoring them through asking their opinions, but in other ways, sort of violating them. So,
using
both
them.
can be true for sure.
People are complicated.
Yep.
It's tough.
Yeah.
But, I think we can learn so much, as you said, from the mistakes.
For sure.
From the, best intentions, worst results kind of thing. So much to be learned.
Absolutely. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
And gleamed. We should not necessarily shy away from them, but, it shouldn't be suppressed, I feel like, a film like this. It should definitely be a historical record, right?
And it's earned its place.
Viewed within context, of course. I think context is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, like if
this.
If I'm gonna tell somebody what the Inuit experience is like, I'm not gonna throw this movie on right away.
Right. Instead, it's kind of more of a look at documentaries, right, and how they can be constructed or narratives.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, documentaries, and everybody, I would say, the documentaries are always subjective in some way.
Absolutely.
You've always give the example that even just pointing your camera at something, you've selected to look at something and look away from something else.
That's a great way of putting it.
So something just as simple as that is subjective. Where's the line? Well, falsifying stuff. But what if you don't have footage of that, right? I mean, do you need to label it docudrama? Well, we don't he didn't know how to do that in 22. No. We might see it today where somebody's doing a documentary and it's worthwhile to reenact something and clearly label it as such.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the film language to understand that. And he didn't certainly have the film language to understand that in 20. So again, I'm not letting him off the hook, but I am saying, so to speak, but I am saying that, you know, he was, you know, working at something while he was part of inventing it at the same time too.
Accidentally
so
inventing a whole
definitely
genre.
are abounding.
I love the way you put that about how like documentaries are subjective by like choosing what you frame. It reminds me of this really famous photo. It was this child after an earthquake, right, who had been emaciated and injured, and it won all these awards, right? And then another photo came out a few years later of just pulling the frame back, and it was all these journalists just gathered around the child taking the photos. Just like the truer story, the wider context, often it's not. Yeah,
so photojournalism, simple. Different medium, but some of the same results there, right? That's a really good point, really good connection there.
Yeah. That's cool.
Have you seen any of Flaherty's other work?
It's been a long time. I was trying to watch them before I came here, but then I got stuck on some other stuff. Moana.
Yeah.
Have you guys watched that one yet?
No, not yet. Just the 2014 version.
Yeah.
the remake.
A little different, but, you know, same. No, I think it's not quite the same. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that also just shows his fascination with the other, but also how he treats the other. So those are the two. And because I was very interested in you know, sort of what I call inside out representation of Indigenous people when I was writing my thesis, because I wanted to know people who had that input, right? And so I started with this as sort of an example of why it might be that inside out, even though it really was more outside in, if that makes sense, like the producer director sort of creating as opposed to the people who are being documented, kind of telling what to do. So I kind of had that as almost a starting point, if you will.
Yeah, definitely got to check that out. He has this other one called The Man of Iran, which is
I've heard of it but haven't seen it.
Yeah, about the Irish cultures on the islands of Iran, and that one sounds really interesting. I love that culture.
I'd be very interested to check out more of his work and see like how it evolves and like this movie. It feels like it's, you know, it's so much like about Nanook, like and just his relationship with you know, filmmaking and that. So I'd be I'm curious to see once he gets or figures out what it is to make a film a little bit more, you know, having made one.
If the other ones are as constructed, as much of a narrative. You know?
So do you guys think, as filmmakers, do you think sometimes somebody's first work can be their best work?
Yeah, sometimes you like, who's the one who did Donnie Darko, right? Yeah. Has he made anything good since then?
I don't know.
Often, there's the one-hit wonders who just come out and just right off the bat, it just hits at the right time, right place, and they are kind of just following that up their whole career.
Yeah, or with a lot of those kind of filmmakers too, where they get that like massive ego boost and they're like, oh, this is the movie I make now, right? Like, I can't think, The Sixth Sense guy. Yeah, M. Night Shyamalan, where his first movie maybe wasn't the twist movie, but after The Sixth Sense, right, everything was.
Everything had to be a twist. You had to live up to that.
Yeah, he had to live up to his own name.
Yeah, his brand
almost,
exactly. Right?
Yeah. It's interesting that...
It is real interesting.
As a filmmaker, you can become locked into just yourself.
Like, even like Christopher Nolan, who I still think... I think he still makes good films, kind of just gets locked into that like style of his, right?
Or even Wes Anderson, right? Where he's really locked into his own visual style and quirky characters.
And it can be... I'm not the biggest Wes Anderson fan. I can find it a little...
I am.
I love Wes Anderson too.
I loved Asteroid City, but I just find it a little too much sometimes, how deep he goes on his own style. I don't know. I'd like to see him make a horror movie. That's what I'm saying.
So that's the other thing, right? As a director, like, do you just stay in your lane that you love? Or because some directors do an amazing job of that, and they keep doing it. And it might be the same stuff, but they do... fresh looks at the same stuff. And other directors can just make, they'll make a Western, then a horror movie, and then a comedy. And that shows a different sort of, expertise and genius, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, both are valid for sure.
Yeah. We even look at Orson Welles. I know someone we've becoming... we're film students getting into. But with F for Fake, that documentary is just... maybe the most like mind-blowing documentary I've ever seen. He doesn't pretend that it's not subjective at all.
Yeah,
right?
He fully leans into that.
Yeah, and I love that. And I wasn't expecting that from him.
Yeah. Some of my favorite filmmakers working today are the ones who will blur the line between fiction and reality.
Yeah.
If you've heard of the Canadian filmmaker Matt Johnson. Yep. Yeah, he's really fantastic. I love Blackberry, even though it's a lot less that style, but his early works like The Furies and Operation Avalanche, they blend that line so well, and it's just so compelling and like drawing a distinction to it, right? and what these things mean, right, in larger context. It's awesome. Big fan.
Have you guys seen Radiant City?
I've
No.
not.
It's a documentary. I'm trying to remember who the names don't come.
It's okay.
It's just called Radiant City.
Okay.
I think the guy was on CBC, so that's why I think I should know his name. I won't tell you about it. How do the critters do they like spoilers or?
Oh, we spoil most.
You spoil
Yes.
everything? Okay. Well, Radiant City was a documentary. I can't remember the date. I want to say like 2006, 5, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's about Calgary as it was really going through a lot of growth. And so it's set in Calgary and set in a suburb in Calgary. And it is... yeah, I'll ruin it. So it starts out as a documentary, and then you find out it's totally fake, right? Like it's
wow.
totally actors and
Yeah.
everything like that. So it's just playing with that genre as well.
It's so
That
interesting.
at what point is this clearly fake? Because they're just, they're talking to a camera, so people get a little bit uncomfortable and awkward on
Yeah.
camera anyway. And then you realize, oh, they're acting awkward on camera. They're not.
That's crazy.
That
So
sounds
it's worth
really
a watch. I love it
fantastic.
because it's about urban sprawl and things like that.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. Social messages in addition to this kind of
Yeah.
I won't say
interesting form.
experimental, but yeah, just kind of playing with the form as well.
Definitely gonna watch
Yeah.
that. Me and Sam lately have been really getting into Nathan Fielder, another
Okay,
great
yeah.
Canadian
Yeah.
artist, and he always blurs that line between real and fake, and talks about a lot of contemporary issues in his new show, The Curse, of like white guilt and gentrification.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah, it's really fantastic.
Yeah, highly would recommend that show.
So uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable.
So uncomfortable. It like perfectly emulates the documentary kind of like HDTV
Yep.
kind of style.
Yep.
It's
Yeah.
really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a style, it's a construction, it's so many things, right?
It's so interesting.
Yeah. And I love it when documentarians they really push the documentary look when they don't need to, like as if it's a
Oh,
handheld
yeah.
camera. Well, nobody
Going
really needs a
into it.
handheld
Yeah,
camera
exactly.
anymore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless you got an iPhone in a parking lot or something like that. But so they make it look like it's real,
it's
gritty.
spontaneous or
there's
something.
less to
gritty.
be found in the cutting edge quality and more to be
Yeah.
found in like that grain and that shake.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
adds
When you're
some
like,
form to it.
when you watch a Matt Johnson movie or something, like, how could they have faked that? Like,
Yeah.
it
There's this
just
long
it has to be
sequence
real.
where they like
Yeah.
cut footage of Matt Johnson and this other actor over footage of Stanley Kubrick. And it's like going over the moon landing being fake. It's
Oh, okay.
so
Yeah.
interesting, so impressive.
Yeah.
Really great stuff.
Yeah, that's really creative too, right?
Yeah.
And so
It
that,
is.
I mean, going back to Flaherty, he was part of inventing the genre, and
Right.
now
Yeah.
all these other filmmakers are pushing it and exploring, and I think that's the cool thing that he,
Yeah.
set us on a
on this path.
that
Yeah.
people are meandering along and
Yeah.
meandering off of a lot of
For
times, and
better or
finding ways
worse.
to blend. Because I mean, it's the label of this film is a documentary, but as we know, it's really not. It is
Yeah.
No.
part of it was a story that he was telling, and part of it was a documentary.
Yeah.
And then we criticize him for it being a story, but because it's not a documentary, so it kind of is like,
Yeah.
does a documentary really have to be that idea of real people doing the things they were really
Yeah.
doing?
If this movie wasn't labeled as a documentary, do you feel it would be still as problematic? and
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean-
we might look at it in a different way. Like I think the sort of ethical issues that we sort of launch at this film they're not just about the falsification of things.
Yeah.
I mean, Michael Moore. I like Michael Moore's work, but he also, like I said, there's some subjectivity there too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, it's no different in that way, unless you're doing violence to people in their culture.
Yeah.
That there
Gets
is, I
rough.
think, a really, a much more egregious sort of ethical violation in that way, as opposed to just sort of playing along with the line of truth and fiction, if you will.
Yeah. It's a fascinating topic nonetheless. It's just so interesting how the first documentary ever that cemented the form wasn't even a documentary.
Yeah.
Yes. Wasn't really intended to be one either,
Yeah.
right? He
Tells
wanted
you-
to just make a narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tells you so much about how art develops and
It does,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah. We usually rate the movies after
Yeah.
we
Okay,
finish them.
okay.
Yeah. Out of 10.
Yeah.
So I gave this one a 7 out of 10.
Me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't mean much, but yeah.
I'd
Numbers are-
give it a 7 out of 10 as well. Like
Yeah.
I think there's
Unanimous.
so much to learn from it. So
Yeah.
7 out of 10 for me isn't it that it's a great movie, but just
No.
it has a really great place
important.
in
Yeah.
film history and film.
Absolutely.
undeniably important.
Yeah.
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 And some striking.
But we can't give
visuals
it
as well.
any more than a 7.
No,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's like you gotta realize the impact. and
Exactly.
Yeah.
You gotta watch the record scene and see.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
oh,
You're
Exactly.
it's no good. And Flaherty maybe killed Nanook. Maybe. Who's to say?
That's a darker take than
Yeah.
I've heard. But you just started a new rumor there.
you got to make the documentary about
Yeah.
that.
I'll
your
completely
faux
construct
documentary.
it. Yeah.
Have you guys seen Antonarjuat, The Fast Runner?
No,
I have
no.
not.
Okay, then you need to put down the mics and recording
Yeah.
equipment right now and go watch it. So that is Zacharias Kunuk.
Okay.
So I can't remember the year again. I want to say like 2001-ish. And so it's set in around the year 1000, but it's
Okay.
the Canadian North, Inuit. And
Okay.
Yeah.
So as always, content warning for your critters out there. Google before you watch.
Yes.
But if you want a different version, so it's sort of about mythology and things
Okay.
like that, but it's a very different representation, I
that'd
think.
be
And that's
really
more that
interesting.
inside out that I was talking about, because
Yeah.
Kunuk
Yeah.
himself is Inuk and his lead actor is as well. And so, yeah, it's definitely worth a watch
Yeah,
for sure for
that
you
sounds
and the
interesting.
critters
Check that
too. Yeah.
Right up my alley, because this film definitely made me Nanook of the North made me interested in that culture and how they operate. So to actually see a perspective from one of them,
Yeah,
is-
so it's much later, but it does
Yeah.
sort of see where the genre could. So that's a fictional. I shouldn't.
Yeah,
So
okay.
to clarify, that is a fictional representation. But if you're going to tell a story,
Yeah.
this is a good story for sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely have to check that out. We usually end our cast with the guest recommending a movie just to the critters. It can be anything.
Well, I guess I just did
Yeah.
that, didn't
Yeah,
I? With
perfect.
Anton
Really
Arshawat,
perfect.
Fast Runner.
Yeah.
There we go.
You knew the form.
And
It's great.
Radiant City too.
And
Yeah.
Radiant City, yeah,
Yeah.
two really fun ones, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Guys, got some good movies to watch out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, I think this was a great
Yeah.
fun, unless you have anything
Well, thank you
else
guys
to
so
say.
much. It was super
Yeah,
fun
this was
to
awesome.
be here and talk about something that I enjoy talking about and hearing your thoughts as
It was
well.
great to have
so.
you on. I'm-
Felt good to have like someone who has education, and training in their field. Because before
Yeah.
we've just had our friends.
Yeah,
and
pretty much.
pretty much random guys.
Well, so, as sometimes people do a better job, early on in
Yeah.
their careers than later. So I will leave that up to your critters to decide.
we'll get
Sometimes
back to
people,
you.
early on in their careers can figure things out in a really interesting
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
way.
Well, I
so.
can say we're certainly getting better at the
I hope
Critterpit.
so.
I think
I
that,
hope
that
so.
things are getting
Our
slightly
early
better.
episodes were rough.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to hear the rest of your episodes too. I'm one of
Gonna
those
be-
podcast guests who's never heard the podcast. So
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's great.
We're gonna have to go to what is it, 2,000 movies now, around there.
Yeah, there's a lot.
So
of.
we're gonna be doing this till the day we die.
okay, well that's fair.
Yeah. All right,
It's-
great. Well,
yeah.
yeah, thank you so much for
You
coming
bet.
on.
Thank you guys for
This
having me.
was
Appreciate it a
awesome.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.